Vlookups with multiple search terms, cleaning data in cells from form submissions, and updating graphs when data is dynamically added to a sheet. Today, I'm giving my 2 cents on how to solve various problems from r/Google Sheets. Let's dive in. Okay, first one up. I have a question here from user Chris MW7787. I'm wondering if there's a means to create a line graph in Google Sheets that focus on the most current data entered. For example, if I'm tracking weight loss, I would like the line graph to display the past week or two of data. I think I have a pretty good idea of what this person's trying to do. I use this at work quite a lot when I'm building dashboards, especially to show the most recent data. Often it's helpful to separate the sheet itself from the data that you're actually looking to display. So generally I would have a table with all of the weight loss data and then a separate table that just shows the last 7 days, and we build the graph basically just using that. In order to do this, I'm just going to generate some dummy data for January and add this into the spreadsheet. So we're going to have the date in column 1 and the weight in column 2. In order to generate some dummy data, I'm just going to use randarray. So it works very similarly to the normal rand, except in an array, would you believe? So you can see the number of rows and columns. The number of columns is 1, and the row I'm actually just going to use in this case a count of the number of values that we have here, so that it makes the full list here. So now I've got some random data, but obviously that doesn't really look like someone's weight. So let's say it's kilos, and let's say the person is sort of aiming for 100 kilos and working their way down. So what I might do here is do 100 plus that. And we need to wrap that in an Arrayformula now. That's obviously still giving us a bit of a brief range, so I can also just multiply this by, let's say, 6. And last of all, we're assuming that they're tracking downwards, so I'm actually just going to put all of this into a sort column is 1 and ascending is false. There we go. So now we have data starting at 105 and dropping to 100. So that can be quite a good way of generating some random data, just if you're trying to test things out and you just want to build something. If you don't have data to hand, you can just generate it like that. So now that we actually have the data, we can actually answer the question. So there are a few different ways that you can do this. I'll start with the shortest to type and move up and just talk a little bit about all of these different methods. They might not always make sense, but I think it's useful to see a couple of different ways of achieving the same result. So the first formula we're going to look at is filter. Filter takes a range and allows you to apply a condition to that range to filter it down. The range that we would look at here is both columns, but actually for the filter we just need the condition, which is to do with the date. So I would just select this column and I would say it's greater than a specific date. That would allow us to filter it. There's 2 ways we could achieve this date depending on the actual goal of the sheet. So if we're assuming that every day on the day the weight is going to be added, we could use today. Today takes the current date value, and I could just minus 7. So that would just give us 7 days of data. Unfortunately, because we've done 2 extra days here, it adds them onto the end. So if you just wanted to show the last 7 days, rather than use today, we could reference back to the dates column itself. So we could use max instead, and what max will do is it takes the highest value from the range given. So if I do max, then that brings us down to 7 values because it's just taking the last 7 in the sheet. The next formula to discuss here is query. We can use this in both of the ways that I showed how filter works, but the syntax is a little bit different. Query effectively emulates like an SQL type query in a text format. It means we have to be a little bit clever if we want to do anything dynamic with the format itself. So here I can select again the same range. Once we have the range selected, we can write a query similar how you might in SQL. So select star means I want all of the columns. We can add some conditions here using a where clause. So here the where clause I want is when column C is greater than a date. Unfortunately, we can't just write greater than today minus 7 or anything like that because it's all within a string, so we actually have to escape it and then bring it back into the query once it's calculated the value. We can achieve this by writing date and then putting the date itself in quotation marks. We then end the query here and use an ampersand to concatenate several sections together. So ultimately we'll end up with something like that as the query, but in here we want to put the actual value that we're calculating. So similar, we can put today, but we have to have the date format very specifically written. So we wrap this in a text and write it out as year, month, day. Now we have that, that's going to allow us to select whatever we want here. I've selected today, so it's actually only showing data greater than today, but obviously I can do the same thing as before. I can do minus 7, or again, I can change this to Two different approaches to achieve the same result. The last one's a little bit more work. I still quite like it, and I might consider using it in some scenarios. We can generate the dates that we want to show specifically, and then Vlookup against the original data set. So here I might say equals today minus 7, which gives me that day, and then I can just add these +1 so that we get the correct amount of data that we want. And then we can just use a Vlookup to actually find the results that we want. I'm using an Arrayformula here to do all of the Vlookups in one go because I don't like to drag formulas down. I've got a whole video on that. I'll put a link in the description. So now I have the weights here again, and that's pretty much what you want. As soon as you've got this, you can just generate the chart again. Except now we've just got the date range that we want, and if we add more data to the bottom, every day this will update. U/cutbus asks, hi, how can I remove the S equals and M equals on the Google Sheet for each column? I'm getting responses from a Google form and need to separate the extra characters to analyze the data properly. I guess the first question here really is like, how is the form set up that results in you getting those particular characters in your answers? I wonder if there's a better way of doing it, but we don't have access to that, so we'll just focus on actually what this is asking about, which is a nice, easy data cleaning scenario. In the answers section for this one, there's a couple of really nice suggestions by Kudden replace all. If you want to just do a find and replace, that's probably really easy if you've not got extra data coming in. They've also suggested RegexReplace, which I'll walk through in a second. Whilst I really like the RegexReplace approach to this, there are some other ways to solve this, and I want to run through all of them. So rather than RegexReplace, if it's always going to be the same number of characters before and including the equal sign, we can just do sort of a string replace. This is technically less processor intensive, but obviously we're talking about a very small amount of data here, so it doesn't really matter. So jumping into the spreadsheet here, when we use replace, we are asked for the text, the position, the length, and the new text. So the text that we're looking at here is initials. The position that we want to start the replacing at is position 1, and the number of characters we want to remove, or the length, is 2. The new text we can actually just leave completely blank because we don't want it, and you can see it's already actually suggesting what the outcome will be here. And that's probably the easiest way to do all of these in one go. We can take this replace a step further though and combine it with a find. Find will allow us to search for a character within a string and returns the position of that character within the string. In this example, I can take exactly the same string again and search for the equal sign, which is the delimiter in this case. The result from find is 2, which is the position in the string, and that also matches the length because we're starting at the beginning of the string. So now I can copy this find formula and replace that number 2 here with that. What that means is if we change this beginning to a much longer word, it's still going to show us exactly the same thing. You can see that find has updated, but the actual output is exactly the same. The next example is the example that was given on Reddit, RegexReplace. The way that RegexReplace works is it uses regular expressions, or regex, to match patterns of text and then replace them. So in this case, we can do something like S equals, and then the replacement can just be blank as we had it before, but obviously because we're matching a pattern here, we can actually do that slightly differently. In regex, the syntax for this would be A to Z. Actually, we can take this a step further and we can add the star in here after A to Z. What that does is it says match this as many times as possible before it gets to that equal sign. And what that means is actually I can change this now to anything I want beforehand and it's not going to change it. On a very similar vein, we can use RegexExtract. It works in a similar way, but rather than focusing on the stuff that we want to remove, we're actually just pulling out the data that we want. In regular expressions, we can use normal brackets to denote that's the part that we actually care about and to ignore everything else. So with this formula, we can take a similar approach. We can still use A to Z and the star equals to denote the part that we don't really care about, and then we'll use brackets to denote the part that we do care about, which is everything inside here. We can use the dot to determine that we want whichever character matches within this range, and then we can use the star again to match as many times as possible. What that means is that now we can go back in here and we can add whatever we want, and it's going to grab everything within that range. User Iliosporos asks, hello sheet gurus, I want to use equals query to search for a result based on 2 criteria on the row it is in. Here's the command. It sends back a parse error, can you help me please? Someone has rightly pointed out that the reason for the parse error here is that there's no way to concatenate these different sections of the formula within the query. We have these 2 cell references that are within the query that we want to create. However, because they haven't been concatenated properly, that's going to cause the parse error. We can just add ampersands in, as I've done here, and that will solve the issue itself. But I don't think that this is the right solution for what's trying to happen here. It looks like Iliosperus is trying to do 2 Vlookups at the same time, which we can actually achieve with a Vlookup and an Arrayformula modification. So I'm going to show you how that works as well. So I've just created some dummy data here to look at which of these locations in which markets might be live. Now we want to return the status based on 2 parameters that we have been given for that query. We might want a market field and a location field, and then we'll use those to determine whether it's live or closed. Depending on the size of the data here, you might still want to use a drop down to hold that. It might be a bit overkill here, but I find it much easier to work with data validation. It just makes things feel cleaner, so I'm going to do that here. Again, we can just right click to add data validation. We can use a drop down, and I'm going to select UK and EU. And then for location, we can do the same thing. So now we have our 2 drop downs here, and we can create the Vlookup to see what the status is of each of these. So when we use a Vlookup with multiple fields at the same time, we use the ampersand to concatenate those ranges again. So this time the search key will be H5 and H6. The ampersand here is turning these 2 cells into a single search key. For the range component, we want to create our own new range with 2 columns. The first column will be the concatenation of the market and the location, and the second column will be the status. Once we've created that new range, we just need to use the index, which again we can set to 2 because this is now column 2 of 1 and 2, and we want an exact match. Because we're transforming ranges of data inside this Vlookup and making use of array literals, those curly brackets, we need to wrap this whole formula in an array formula, even though we're only looking for a single output from the Vlookup. We have to press Control or Command Shift and Enter, which will wrap that within an array formula. And now we have the status here. You could take this further if you wanted and maybe put some conditional formatting on it, but obviously we don't need that right now. But just to show you how this works, we can change these dates, these fields, and get different results each time. We spoke a lot today about array formulas. I've got a great video on that which you can click on right here. And in the meantime, if you've got an interesting project or a Google Sheets question, drop it in the comments below and let's see if we can't solve it in the next video.